John Jones, a young 26-year-old man, decided to explore the Nutty Putty Cave in the Utah desert near Salt Lake City. This wasn't his first caving experience, as he and his brother Josh used to explore caves around Utah, even though it was the first time he would have gone into the Nutty Putty Cave specifically. The cave was considered beginner-friendly, as it was well-mapped, and the first main parts were accessible to everyone, such as the maze or the big slide. There were also some harder areas for more experienced cavers, like the birth canal, which was an incredibly tight passage. John wasn't going alone. He went with a group of 11, including family and friends. The cave was closed off at the time because some cavers had previously gotten stuck, but it was reopened and accessible only to those with a specific permit. Josh managed to get one, and on November 24th, 2009, they went in. Everyone stayed in the beginner-friendly areas, but John and Josh quickly got bored and started looking for the harder tunnels they had heard about. They knew about the birth canal, one of the tightest passages in the cave, which, after the narrowest part, had a room where they could stand up and turn around to head back. They ventured into the narrow passages of the cave, and at one point, they reached an area called the Corkscrew, named that way because of how hard it was to get through. It was after the Corkscrew that cavers would normally turn around, but 5 years before, an accident had happened in that exact spot. A 16-year-old boy named Brock Clark got stuck there, even though he was just 5 feet 7 inches tall and weighed only 140 pounds. He had to wait a whole 14 hours before getting freed. John, however, was 6 feet tall and weighed 200 pounds, so he clearly knew he couldn't turn around to go back in that specific part of the tunnel. In a space only 12 inches high, he squeezed his stomach in and kept moving forward until he got to a point where he was headfirst at a downward angle. It looked like there was an area ahead where he could finally turn around, so he kept going in. But what he didn't know was that beyond that ledge, the area was uncharted. No one had been there before him. He still thought he was in some part of the birth canal, and since he knew many cavers felt stuck just like he was, but eventually
I mean, like, if you're going down a cave, and you know someone's gotten stuck there, and you know you're fucking, what, 5 inches taller than them, 60 pounds heavier than them, you're gonna keep going down the cave. What fucking part of that seems fun?
found a place to turn around. He continued on. After a while, however, he started sliding toward the bottom of the tunnel, almost doing a handstand to hold on and try to push himself back up. He immediately yelled to his brother to stop, and they started discussing what they should do, as John's arms were starting to lose strength. They decided to move forward just a little more, and then turn around, because John saw a hole in the floor ahead that he thought might lead to a larger space. What he didn't realize, however, was that it was just a dead-end opening at the bottom of the tunnel. So once he went in, he was stuck in a vertical position, upside down. The opening was just 18 by 10 inches, and any effort to get out proved useless, so he screamed for help. His brother Josh came in feet first and squeezed one of John's legs with his own, trying to pull him out. This also didn't work, and after Josh became exhausted, they decided that he would exit the cave to call for help. John waited there upside down, and gravity kept pushing him further into the opening, with his chest getting compressed against the walls, allowing him to take only small breaths. The first
I don't know, like, if you're going down a cave and there's like uncharted parts of it, why would you keep going? Or like even like fucking you're going down the cave, uncharted parts, really hard parts, and you just left all your family. What the fuck?
first rescuer arrived after 3 hours. She had a rope tied to her ankle, so she could be pulled back out while she put another rope around John's legs to try to pull him out. This also didn't work, so they decided to install a pulley system, which was much stronger than just a human pull, and it was what had gotten Brock Clark free 5 years prior. However, this required a lot of time, since each piece of equipment had to be brought through the entire cave, which took nearly an hour. Also, only one assistant at a time could be there, and only small tools could be brought in. After spending the whole night there, John's body was starting to show the signs of being upside down for more than 12 hours. He had been completely lucid up to that point, but now he was starting to lose his sanity, hallucinating. The oxygen concentration in the air was also dropping lower and lower. During this time, they brought in a device that allowed him to speak with his wife, who encouraged him to hang on. John assured her that he would be out with her soon. Around 4 o'clock, the pulleys were ready, so rescuer Ryan Schurz, who was inside the cave, grabbed John's legs and they activated the pulley. John started screaming in agony as his legs turned blue and no longer had a pulse, telling them to stop. After a brief pause to let him calm down, they tried again, and it seemed to be working. John rose high enough that Ryan was able to make eye contact with him and give him some Gatorade through a
Why is everyone spiraling over YouTube banning ad blockers? Like, chill guys, just use Pi. It's a free Chrome extension and it basically blocks ads.
tube. His situation was still very bad, however, as his lifeless legs were hitting the ceiling and blocking him from getting out of the hole. They were strongly considering breaking his legs, as time was really starting to run out. Then, the rope holding the pulley broke, pulling everything toward Ryan's face and injuring his face, lips, tongue, and causing a concussion. He lost consciousness briefly, and when he woke up, he immediately left the cave. Meanwhile, John had slipped back into the hole, and it took another hour to repair the pulley. When they tried pulling him out once more, John wasn't responding. Since it would have been impossible to lift him without his help, they sent a medic inside the cave to check whether he was still alive. At 11:56 on November 25th, John Jones was declared dead. The entire cave system was then closed off with concrete, and they placed a plaque to commemorate John Jones's life. Judan Cave. Two friends, Wang
How does like going in there seem worth it? I don't even know how that would be.
Yuan and
Like you could die in there. Like what is the adrenaline rush? Go like fucking do some ecstasy or something.
Wang Tao were highly experienced divers who wanted to enter Judan Cave in China to break their own personal depth record. Someone had previously placed a guideline that extended for 525 feet, but they wanted to extend it by another 35 feet, aiming for a total depth of 558 feet. This plan would require them to leave the existing guideline for some time, and because those depths are already dangerous, doing so would have significantly increased the risk. However, they were not only diving experts in general, but also had
Wait, why wouldn't they just like tie the rope to the other rope and then hold on to it and keep going down so you like didn't die instead of just leaving it behind?
already completed 15 dives in the cave's northern entrance, so they felt quite confident. They even decided to do a practice dive in open water to reach 500 feet, just to see what it would be like and identify potential problems. Unfortunately, Tao had to skip the practice dive due to illness, so Yuan went alone, and everything went smoothly. On April 18, 2014, after months of preparation, they decided it was time to begin their dive. They estimated it would take about 20 minutes to reach their target depth, and they would only be able to stay there for a few minutes before starting their ascent. Even just a few extra minutes at those depths would require many additional hours of decompression. They also estimated it would take about 3 hours and 50 minutes to get back to the surface safely, allowing enough time for the pressure to not be too harsh on their bodies. Time was of the essence, as every minute mattered. When they started their descent, they noticed that visibility was greatly reduced because of the rainfall in the days prior, but they decided it was not bad enough to postpone the dive.
This guy watching another one was like silt was coming up and they couldn't see shit, but they kept going. Like, why would you do that? Why wouldn't you just wait until it's like perfectly safe? That's fucking whack.
Under normal conditions, divers could usually see about 50 feet ahead, but on that day, visibility was only about 6.5 feet. As extra safety measures, they had previously placed air tanks at various depths, each containing the appropriate gas mixture for that depth. Additionally, a friend named Pei stayed near the cave's surface to assist if needed. Yuan's role was to keep them on the guideline, while Tao's role was to place arrow markers along the line to indicate the direction back to the cave entrance. At such extreme depths, having the correct gas mixture is crucial because both nitrogen and oxygen can become problematic under high pressure. They followed all the guidelines carefully, switching tanks at the appropriate depths. However, around 538 feet, Yuan suddenly felt as though he might lose consciousness. Realizing they needed to ascend to counter these symptoms, and considering they were only 13 feet beyond the established guideline, with visibility around half that distance, they turned back toward the line and the surface. Yuan led them to where the guideline should have been, but they were met with a terrifying situation. The guideline was gone. They searched desperately, hoping to feel or spot it, and eventually found it. But now, there was another problem. Their panic at losing the line had caused them to breathe faster, which consumed more gas than normal. By the time they rediscovered the line, Yuan's cylinder for that depth was nearly empty, so he had to switch back to his main tank, which contained surface air. This was far from ideal. Although he initially felt okay, around the 393-foot mark, he began trembling involuntarily. They desperately needed to reach their next set of cylinders, which were at 243 feet, about 150 feet away. Yuan still had hope until he looked down and saw Tao stuck under a rock. Because of the low visibility, Tao had accidentally swam into the rock and gotten wedged there. Yuan also noticed that Tao wasn't attempting to free himself, but was instead shining his light at his neck, signaling that he was running out of air. Yuan immediately gave Tao an emergency mouthpiece, and Tao freed himself. They resumed their ascent with very little air left, sharing what remained. After some quick calculations, they realized they had roughly 3 minutes of air before it would be gone. Tao was extremely fatigued, and Yuan had to pull him by the arm. When they were about 300 feet from the surface, Yuan checked his air supply again and saw there was only enough for one person to ascend another 130 feet. Fortunately, about 50 feet away were the next set of cylinders they had placed earlier. Suddenly, Yuan saw Tao float past him, rising upward and disappearing in the murky water. Yuan knew Tao must have lost consciousness because he made no attempt to hold on. Yuan swam after him as quickly as he could, but he couldn't see Tao anywhere. With his tank about to run dry, he had to reach the next set of cylinders before searching again. He quickly got to those cylinders, switched tanks, and went back to look for Tao. As he descended once more, he still couldn't find him. His new tank began to run low, so he had to ascend again to the next set of cylinders. Unfortunately, those cylinders were placed at a higher depth because they were meant for use in shallower water, and they would be extremely dangerous to use at deeper depths. If someone were to use those tanks and descend too far, they would risk nitrogen narcosis, a state similar to drunkenness, as nitrogen is absorbed too rapidly. Despite this risk, Yuan still tried to go deeper in search of Tao. At some point, he lost consciousness briefly, and although he woke up moments later, it was the warning sign that he needed to get out immediately. He attempted to follow the necessary decompression stops on the way up, but in his panicked and weakened state, he ascended faster than he should have, stopping for about 3 hours instead of the nearly 4 hours required. Upon surfacing, Yuan immediately told Pei what had happened. Shocked, Pei dove in to search for Tao, but soon realized Yuan might also be in serious trouble because of his rapid ascent. Matter of fact, when Pei returned to the surface, he found Yuan showing symptoms of both nitrogen narcosis and decompression sickness. As soon as Yuan removed his regulator, he began vomiting and twitching, experiencing severe dizziness. They had no choice but to abandon the immediate search for Tao in order to get Yuan urgent medical help. By this time, Yuan was in agonizing pain, especially in his legs. Fortunately, rescuers arrived quickly, but before anyone could re-enter the cave, they needed a full day to plan and gather the correct tanks for those depths. By then, it was almost certain that Tao had died, and the following day, his lifeless body was found at a depth of 176 feet. Yuan spent several days in a decompression chamber, but ultimately made a full recovery. Kalimba Cave Tragedy. It was December 2004, and 9 divers were about to enter the Kalimba cenote for the second time while on vacation in Mexico. Their plan was to follow the guidelines to the Boschchen cenote before turning back. They split into 2 groups. The first would go ahead and set markers to highlight the correct path, while the second would follow. Since the
I couldn't like ever be like one of those people who like you're fucking like you see a little hole in the ground and it's like full of water and you're like I'm gonna go back in there. So you like put on your shit and you like jump down and like you don't know where you're going. So you're just like fucking going around in the dark. Because it's like the 14th century. So if you're like swimming in like the darkness. And then like you fucking
first group had more efficient oxygen tanks. They planned to go farther before returning, while the second group would start heading back earlier. As Team 2 was expected to resurface first, they would remove a specific type of marker called cookies to signal their exit. Seeing that the cookies were gone, Team 1 would then remove their own markers on the way back, ensuring the cave remained clean for future divers. Everything went according to plan. Team 1, noticing the absence of the cookies, began their ascent, but when they resurfaced, Team 2 was nowhere to be found. They searched the area for 30 minutes, but found no sign of them. Regrouping at the Kalimba cenote, they geared up to re-enter the tunnel and search for them. By this point, Team 2 had little oxygen left, but suddenly, bubbles appeared in the water, and 2 divers quickly resurfaced. They immediately began explaining what had happened underwater. Instead of following the intended exit path, Team 2 had mistakenly turned left. The return trip should have been short, but they only realized their mistake after swimming 1,400 feet in the wrong direction. By the time they noticed, they were nearly 3,000 feet from the original exit. However, another exit was just 300 feet away. Reaching it posed a serious challenge. They needed to cross a 70-foot gap with no guidelines, making it a dangerous risk of getting lost. Kent, one of the divers, took out his safety line, secured it, and began swimming across. He was just short of reaching the guideline when his line stopped him. It was too short to cover the long gap. Time was running out, and turning back, Kent saw the rest of the group heading toward the initial path, so he swam fast to catch up. By then, their oxygen levels were critically low, and with no air pockets in the cave, the situation was becoming life-threatening. After
I just wonder how like those air pockets get in the cave. Like if it was just a cave in the ground, and then they filled with water, and the water like pushed all the air out. Like how would there be air in the cave? Maybe if there's like a little gap in the ceiling, yeah. But like how was there so much oxygen? Like say somebody took one breath and they're like, and then all the oxygen was gone. How would like more be in there? I don't know.
25 minutes of swimming, they finally reached the correct line. A 30-minute swim still lay between them and the exit. Bill's oxygen was nearly gone, with only 200 psi left. He moved next to Jean, who had more air, and she shared hers using her emergency extra mouthpiece. The situation was so bad that in tight passages, Bill had to hold his breath while Jean squeezed through first. Then Michael also began running dangerously low on air. Seeing that Jean and Bill were already sharing and could not help him, he panicked. He was the least experienced of the group, and his tank was almost empty. Fortunately, Kent reached him in time, handed him his emergency mouthpiece, and tried to calm him down. Meanwhile, Jean and Bill made it out with just 500 psi left in Jean's tank. Had they been delayed just a few more minutes, they would have drowned. They immediately informed the others that Michael and Kent were behind them. Their lights had been visible just before they exited. The remaining divers quickly re-entered the tunnel, hoping to find them in time. Just 250 feet inside, they spotted Michael and Kent's lights, but something was wrong. They weren't moving. As they got closer, the truth became clear. Both had run out of oxygen and drowned, just 5 minutes from the exit. If you liked this video, subscribe for similar ones.
Sad. It's like, don't do fucking. Don't sit in a stupid ass cave and like fucking. Like this shit? How would you have fun doing this?
This video is sponsored by War Thunder. William Coughlin. People. After completing the easier historic tour, the guide asked if they wanted to proceed with the more challenging wild tour. Once they agreed, they were required to sign a document acknowledging the risks involved and absolving the operators of any.
You're finna die. You're trying to. Like, the fuck do you get out of that, bro?
Responsibility. This should have been the first red flag, and Kevin decided to opt out, returning to the safer area. The remaining group, now consisting of William, James, and 4 other participants, was led by the guide into the wild tour. He stressed the importance of staying close and reminded them of the potential dangers. As they descended into the lower sections,
We're going through the devil's asshole. Devil's anus. We got fucking 0.4-inch gap. You're gonna have to twist your body in a full circle and do a triple backflip to get through it, and you're most likely gonna die. Oh my god, it's so much fun! Hooray, let's go!
of the cave, they encountered a 30-foot hanging cable ladder with wooden rungs. After climbing down and going a bit forward, there was a second, shorter ladder. At the bottom of the second ladder, the guide informed the group that the official tour had ended. He mentioned they could explore nearby passages if they wished, but noted that they were running behind schedule and that he needed to step away briefly for a phone call. He left the group at the base of the ladder, and this is when William decided to explore a passage he had noticed earlier. He discussed it with James, who agreed, and William attempted to climb back up the second ladder. However, the climb proved difficult. He was 6 feet tall and weighed 220 pounds. Struggling to ascend, William decided to wait for the guide instead. As time passed and the guide didn't return, William attempted to climb the ladder again. Tragically, halfway up, he lost his grip and fell violently, striking his head on a protruding rock before landing hard on the ground. Blood began pooling from his head, and James rushed to help him. Although William remained conscious, he was delirious and visibly stunned. When the guide finally returned, he instructed the group to climb back out the way they came. However, William's condition made this impossible. James, frustrated, demanded the guide call a cave rescue team, but the guide dismissed the idea, insisting that the group work together to get William out. James began to suspect the guide was avoiding involving authorities, perhaps to prevent panic among other visitors. The group decided their best option was to bypass the second ladder entirely and take an alternative route through a narrow, previously mapped corridor, not part of the official tour. With teamwork, they managed to navigate the initial section, carrying William with them. However, the real challenge came when they reached a rough, sharp V-shaped passage, which made gripping difficult. When it was William's turn, he went in head first, but his size made it an extremely tight fit. Halfway through, he became stuck and realized he couldn't move forward or backward. Trapped in a horizontal position with his arms pinned beneath him, he began to panic. The tightness of the passage compressed his chest, making it difficult for him to breathe. The group's attempts to pull him out were futile. As panic set in, the guide instructed James to exit the cave and inform the owner of the situation. James rushed to the surface, but the owner appeared reluctant to involve authorities. The guide, finally recognizing the severity of the situation, went out to get a medkit and to call for emergency services. It took 3 hours for rescue and medical personnel.
3 hours. Bro, at that point, just like put him down. Give him the fucking shot. If I was that dude, I would not
Nell
want
to
be in
arrive.
there.
Meanwhile, James stayed by
Other than
William's
that,
side, trying to keep him calm, but William's responses grew slower and more slurred until he eventually stopped responding altogether. When rescuers reached William, they faced immense challenges. The downward angle of the passage made it difficult to revive him. They brought in heaters to protect him from hypothermia and began evacuating the rest of the group, leaving only James behind to witness what was happening to his friend. A pulley system was installed to try to free William, but every tug caused him immense pain, so much so that he once again started groaning in agony. The rescue team worked tirelessly throughout Saturday, but after 17 hours of efforts, William was tragically pronounced dead. It took an additional 7 hours to extract his body from the cave. I wanted to take this segment to announce today's sponsor, War Thunder, which is a normal overnight camping trip near Hermit Cave. He was accompanied by 2 others, his stepbrother Richard and their mutual friend Ben. During the night, they gathered around a campfire and discussed the nearby cave, sharing legends and stories about its mysterious reputation. The next morning, as they were packing up to head home, their curiosity about the cave got the better of them. The cave was largely unmapped, adding an air of intrigue, so Robert proposed a quick exploration. Ben, however, had to leave early for work, so he headed back home, leaving Robert and Richard to decide
Alright, maybe I go in there like the first 20 feet and take a picture and be like, oh my god, I went in this cave. And then I'm dead then. The fuck?
for themselves. Robert and Richard entered the cave through its
Fucking 4-inch gap to get back out. Like the fuck?
relatively large main entrance without much difficulty. Inside, Robert spotted one of the rumored side passages they had been talking about and decided to explore it. The narrow passage was too tight for more than one person, so Richard decided to wait outside the cave. Robert promised not to go too deep and assured Richard he'd be back soon. As Robert crawled forward, he encountered a section of the cave that was about 150 feet long and full of tight curves, making progress challenging. The real trouble began when he reached a particular point, called the Keyhole Formation. This section was especially dangerous because it was impossible to exit legs first once passed. Unaware of this, Robert continued forward, but when the passage narrowed even further, he decided it was time to turn back. Returning to the Keyhole Formation, Robert realized something terrible. He couldn't pass through it feet first. His only option was to move forward through the even tighter.
Wait, how do you not go through a keyhole? What is it? For what? Oh, so it's like you can't get your legs back around it or something? Oh. That sucks. Yeah, that sucks.
Crevice, hoping the cave would widen enough beyond it for him to turn around. What he didn't know was that the crevice sloped downward at a 30-degree angle. Exhausted, Robert squeezed through the space, exhaling all the air from his lungs just to fit. After several pushes, he reached a horrifying realization. He was stuck. Gravity was working against him, and every attempt to move only worsened his situation. Desperate, Robert began yelling for help, but Richard, waiting outside the cave, couldn't hear him. Worried after some time, Richard ventured into the cave by himself, though he had no flashlight because Robert had taken the only one. Crawling in complete darkness, Richard called out for Robert, who immediately yelled back, letting him know he was trapped and struggling to breathe. Realizing he couldn't reach his stepbrother in the pitch black, Richard left the cave to call for help, and about an hour later, a team of 10 rescuers arrived and began assessing the situation. The primary problem was Robert's location. He was trapped in an extremely deep area, approximately 150 feet from the cave's main entrance. This meant that drilling a shaft from above wasn't an option, so the only way to reach him was through the inside of the cave. The rescuers themselves began experiencing breathing difficulties due to the tight space, so they installed a ventilation system to pump warm air into the passages. Only one rescuer could work at a time due to the cave's tightness, and armed with manual tools, they began trying to widen the keyhole formation. However, the lack of space severely limited their maneuverability, and time was running out. Robert's breathing became more difficult, and he eventually stopped cooperating, making faint gurgling sounds, a sign of potential suffocation. After hours of effort, the rescuers managed to excavate through the keyhole formation and reach Robert's feet. Though unconscious, they felt a faint pulse, which gave them enough hope to try to get him out as quickly as possible. They immediately tried to pull him free, but unfortunately, the attempt failed. A pulley system was considered, but the cave's limestone and gypsum walls were too fragile to support the tension. With no other options, they continued digging around his body, which took an additional hour. When they finally freed Robert, they rushed him outside, where paramedics were waiting. Tragically, it was too late. After 5 hours of relentless rescue operations, Robert Kennedy was pronounced dead. Black Cave Tragedy. In April 1995, Thomas Edward Benning decided to visit Black Cave in Arizona. Having explored the cave before, he felt confident that this would be a relatively safe trip. He entered the cave alone, equipped only with an electric miner's lamp and no helmet. The first part of the cave was familiar to him, and he navigated it without any issues. However, at one point, he noticed a secret side passage that caught his attention. Drawn by curiosity, Thomas strayed from the main route he usually took and began exploring the darker, narrower passage. After venturing deeper into the unfamiliar passage for some time, Thomas decided it was time to turn back. But to his growing concern, he realized that an hour had passed and he was completely lost. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't retrace his steps to the familiar route. As panic began to set in, his situation worsened. His lamp started to flicker and eventually went out, leaving him in total darkness, miles underground. With no source of light, Thomas turned to his last resort, a box of matches. Striking one, he managed to create a faint glow that barely illuminated the rocks around him. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. He continued forward, using one match after another, but the matches burned out quickly, and soon he ran out entirely, leaving him once again surrounded by absolute darkness. Despite the circumstances, Thomas refused to give up. He devised a plan to leave behind small, useless items as markers to avoid circling back to the same spots. Starving, dehydrated, and utterly exhausted, he pressed on until he encountered the Fissure, a narrow crack in the rock barely 4 feet deep. Believing this might be his only chance to reconnect with the familiar route or find a larger opening, he decided to enter it feet first. As he lowered himself into the gap, his hips dropped below the narrowest point, and he suddenly realized his mistake. He was completely wedged. His hips were firmly stuck between the rock walls, rendering him immobile. Using every last ounce of his strength, Thomas tried to lift himself back up, but it was no use. He was now trapped, alone, in the dark, with no one able to hear him. Days passed, and Thomas remained in the same position, growing weaker with each passing moment. Back home, his wife grew increasingly worried when he failed to return. She contacted the police, who began an extensive search of the caves in the area. Unfortunately, Thomas hadn't told anyone exactly which cave he planned to visit, leaving rescuers to search blindly. Miraculously, rescuers eventually spotted his car parked near Black Cave. A rescue team entered the cave, carefully exploring all the mapped sections. They found some of Thomas's belongings, including his glasses and shirt, but they missed the secret side passage he had ventured into. Amazingly, Thomas was still alive at this point, though his condition was rapidly deteriorating. Days passed, and with no further progress, authorities unfortunately called off the search. Thomas was officially declared missing. Refusing to give up, his wife continued pleading with authorities to resume the search. She distributed flyers around the city and reached out to anyone who might have information, but unfortunately, she wouldn't have known about her husband for a long time. It wasn't until December 1996, over a year and a half later, that 3 other cavers exploring Black Cave stumbled upon Thomas's remains in the dark, narrow passage where he had become trapped. Zacaton Sinkhole Incident. On April 6, 1994, diving legend Shek Exley, the first person in the world to log over 100 cave dives, set out to break a new depth record. His goal was to dive through the Zacaton Sinkhole in Mexico, one of the deepest water-filled sinkholes in the world, plunging over 1,000 feet. Shek's passion for deep diving began at a young age when he and his brother would compete to see how deep they could go. Tragically, during one such competition, his brother lost consciousness at around 50 feet and drowned. Despite this, Shek pursued his love for diving, becoming an expert. For context, the average diver is advised not to descend deeper than 150 feet, with 300 feet considered the absolute limit for experienced divers. Accompanied by fellow diver Jim Bowden, Shek meticulously prepared for the record-breaking dive. The event made by fellow diver Jim Bowden, Shek considered the absolute limit for experienced divers.
Beyond 300 feet, and it's advised not to go 100 feet. You want to go 1,000 feet deep? That doesn't make any fucking sense.
divers. Accompanied by fellow diver Jim Bowden, Sheck meticulously prepared for the record-breaking dive. The event drew TV reporters, who wanted to witness this extraordinary feat. As the two divers descended into the Zakatan sinkhole, they wished each other luck. Although diving together, their dives would be independent. Exley had trained for this attempt, pushing his limits in previous dives. During one preparation dive at Bushman's Hole in South Africa, however, something weird happened. He reached an astonishing depth of 863 feet, but experienced alarming symptoms. He began hallucinating, and his body trembled uncontrollably, which are classic signs of high-pressure nervous syndrome, or HPNS. HPNS typically manifests at depths beyond 500 feet and is believed to result from the compression of cell membranes in the central nervous system. The condition can cause confusion, tremors, and even hallucinations, making it incredibly dangerous for divers at those depths. To mitigate these risks, Sheck and Bowden planned to
It's not like you get like you see shit. Seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, or feeling things that aren't real. Hear music, seeing people, animals, lights. Nah, that'd be fucked. If you're like in this deep asshole and you start hallucinating, you see some like light coming towards you, so you just try to crawl towards it, and you're just fucking going like 1,000 feet deeper.
descend slowly, carefully switching tanks as they reached new depths. For the first stretch of their dive, everything went smoothly. However, problems began to arise at around 800 feet. Bowden noticed slight trembling in his hands, an early warning sign of HPNS. At 900 feet, Bowden encountered another issue. His air supply was running critically low. His tank pressure had dropped to 1,080 psi, far below the expected 1,800 psi needed to ensure a safe ascent. Keep in mind that decompression, depending on how deep the divers go, can take up to hours, which meant that Bowden was now in a life or death situation. Realizing the danger, Bowden began his ascent immediately, hoping he could make it back to the surface in time. Exley, however, was in even greater trouble. At around 880 feet, his vision blurred, and his body began trembling uncontrollably. HPNS symptoms, combined with nitrogen narcosis, which is a condition akin to being drunk caused by high-pressure nitrogen, began impairing his ability to think clearly. To steady himself, Exley wrapped his descent line around his arms, but his symptoms worsened, causing him to breathe more rapidly and deplete his air supply at an alarming rate. In a desperate move, he switched tanks, but at such depths, this was not ideal. Disoriented and overwhelmed by his symptoms, Exley became unable to think straight or move. Bowden, ascending cautiously, noticed Exley's descent line with unused tanks still attached. While concerned, he assumed Exley might have successfully reached the sinkhole's bottom and was making his way back up slowly. However, on the surface, the support team grew suspicious. They observed bubbles rising to the surface, but only from one diver, Bowden. A support diver, alarmed, wrote on an underwater slate, "Where's Sheck?" She decided to descend to 250 feet to investigate. At 280 feet, she spotted something chilling, two small white squares hanging from Exley's descent line. Upon closer inspection, she realized they were pages from Exley's diving profile, tools he had used to meticulously plan his dive. The realization was devastating. Sheck was stuck somewhere deep below. Nearly 10 hours after their initial descent, Bowden miraculously surfaced, surviving his own life-threatening dive. Exley, however, a hero that had previously saved numerous other divers, remained in the depths of the Zakatan sinkhole. 3 days later, the recovery team pulled his descent line to the surface, bringing Exley's lifeless body with it. Jim Bowden reached an extraordinary depth of 915 feet during the dive, setting a world record for open-circuit scuba.
This is Zakatan sinkhole. Oh, so it's just a massive fucking hole. That's not fun. Alright, that doesn't work. Yeah, that doesn't seem fun. Oh shit. So they must have been like, how would you even get in there? Oh, it's like a puddle. It must have been like sitting up here and shit. Damn. That blows.
Scuba diving. Again, thank you to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. Don't forget to play it for 6 months.
Man. I guess that's it, bro. Just don't go cave diving, I guess. Damn. That's it, I guess.